Hello, everyone. This is Professor LEC, and welcome to Chapter 4 of U.S. Government. We are talking about civil liberties today, and the difference between civil liberties and civil rights is actually quite simple. However, it's easy to mix them up. Civil liberties are those protections in the Constitution that protects us from government action. Remember, civil liberties are those protections in the Constitution that protects us from government action. And the example of civil liberties are the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. Those are our civil liberties. And it even provides protection for the states under the 10th Amendment. So civil liberties are simply those protections in the Constitution that protects us from the government. Civil rights, which is chapter 5, is simply are those day-to-day activities in which we enjoy, as well as social, public, normal activities that you do throughout life, in which you have a right to enjoy. So a form of civil right is to be able to go to the library, eat at a restaurant, to participate in an election. Those are civil rights. And those are guaranteed in the Constitution by you under the immunities and exemptions clause, essentially. But there's a little bit more to that. Civil rights did not come overnight. And civil rights, as we know it, wasn't clearly explained. But that's chapter 5. Chapter 4 is civil liberties. And as we talked about in chapter 3, there are two forms of sovereignty in this country. You have the federal government, which is, as it says in the supremacy clause, that it's the supreme law of the land under the Constitution. And you have the state government, which is sovereignty under itself. So anything that happens within the state government does control. Federal government must respect state sovereignty. However, the federal government in its properties or through interstate commerce has every right to regulate and pass laws that apply to everyone. Now, here's the thing. One of the things that we've learned is that for a while, especially during the phase of dual federalism, that lasted between basically when the Constitution was constructed to the 1930s, that what the federal government did, it was the federal government, and what the state government did was the state government. And by 1868, when the 14th Amendment was passed, basically the Bill of Rights applied to state government. Now, this was not instantly accepted this way. It took a number of years, and to be quite honest, the first true example of actually the Supreme Court applying this standard, which you'll eventually learn that it's called selective incorporation, didn't happen until the 20s, the 1920s. Basically, what was that, 40 years after it passed, after the new amendment was applied. But the protections, the civil liberties, the Bill of Rights did not apply to the states. And most courts didn't see it that way, especially state courts. So right now, as we go through chapter 4, we're going to learn about the different cases that created this standard and how we now know that civil liberties, the first 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, now applies to everyone throughout the states. So let's get started here. Let me get my handy dandy PowerPoint here. And yes, I hate using the PowerPoint. I've said that many times because I like to teach directly. But the PowerPoint allows me to guide you a little bit easier, and hopefully it does work for you. Now, in Chapter 4, our learning objectives are these: explain the roots of civil liberties in the Constitution and their development in the Bill of Rights. Distinguish between the establishment and the free exercise clauses of the First Amendment. Outline the First Amendment liberties, limitations on the freedoms of speech, press, assembly, and petition. Describe the Second Amendment right to bear arms. Outline the constitutional rights of defendants and the issues involved in protecting defendants' liberties as guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. Explain the origins and significance of the rights of privacy, and evaluate how reforms to combat terrorism have affected civil liberties. So as you see in Chapter 4, we have a lot of things on our plate. So let's move forward. The roots of civil liberties and the Bill of Rights. We're going to talk about the doctrine of incorporation, the Bill of Rights made applicable to the states, and selective incorporation and fundamental freedoms. The incorporation doctrine. Now, as you know, the 14th Amendment is how the Bill of Rights applied to the states. Now, let's look at it from this point. The 14th Amendment, the genesis of this was to resolve the issue of the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott, as you know, in 1857, it took 1854, it took 10 years for this decision to be rendered by the Supreme Court, was thrown out by the Supreme Court for this major reason, because Dred Scott, being a slave, was not considered a citizen of the United States, which made him not have standing before the court. So let me tell you what that is. If you are not a citizen of the United States, if you do not have a legal grievance to bring forward in court in the United States, that means you do not have standing and you have no reason of being in court. For that very reason, that's why Dred Scott was thrown out. When I look at that case, I agree and disagree. My heart disagrees. My brain, and looking how the Constitution was written, how it reflected the laws of this country, reflected among Black people in this country, the court was correct. So that's how I saw it. But we're getting off track here. So when the Civil War was fought and won by the North, the Union, the 13th Amendment was passed, basically enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation, but making slavery illegal in all states of the United States. Of course, at this time it wasn't 50 states, but in the future it would have been, but slavery is illegal. But we had another problem. We had several million free people in this country, and they did not have legal standing in any court. So the 14th Amendment was adopted, in which it says literally that anyone born within the United States is a U.S. citizen. If you were born in the United States, you become a citizen. So it made natural birth in the United States a citizenship right, and it guaranteed it. But it also said that anyone born in the United States will have equal protection under the law, not only in the United States, but throughout the several states. Now, understand that. Equal protection under the law. When you hear the words equal protection and due process, which was also there, equal protection means you will have equal protection under the law throughout the United States and the several states. That means equal protection for any citizen born in the United States will apply. That means the 10th Amendment. Those are your protections from government. And they were to be applied throughout the states and throughout the several states, means every state. This doctrine instituted instantly that every state must abide by the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. But this is how it was interpreted. It was interpreted as a protection for Black people only. So that means for every other person in the United States, the equal protection under the Constitution, the way it was interpreted by the Supreme Court and all the lower courts and state courts, didn't apply to them. It only applied to the newly freed slaves. But that, of course, will change. Due process clause applied to the right. Due process clause is also in the 14th Amendment. And it means that you will receive due process under the law. So if you are ever charged with a crime, you will receive due process or go through the constitutional protected process of being tried. So, and substantive due process means you must prove it or show specifically legal process of someone going through that process or protection. All right, I double clicked, sorry about that. So selective incorporation and fundamental freedoms. Fundamental freedoms. Everybody knows what fundamental freedoms are. Essentially, order, liberty, and justice. Fundamental freedoms, order, liberty, and justice. You have the right of life, liberty, and property. You have the right of liberty and justice and peace in this country. Those are the fundamental freedoms. Those are part of the values that we have as Americans. The rights that states must protect under the 14th Amendment when it was applied and slowly incorporated into the states were the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, right to bear arms, the right to due process, and equal protection under the law. But as I said earlier, that these rights didn't apply until much later. Now, what this chart shows you is an example of selective incorporation. And let me just define selective incorporation. Selective incorporation means that the philosophy of adopting parts of our Bill of Rights through different court cases and applying those civil liberties or civil protections to each state, one court case at a time. Let me say it again. Selective incorporation is the process in which the court used. It's a doctrine in which a case that came before their court that dealt with one of the civil liberties or civil protections in the Constitution. Because of that court case, the adoption of that protection in the Constitution was applied to the states. So every time the court received a case that involved one of the civil liberties, one of the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, it was selectively incorporated into state law by that case. So let's look at what we have here. One of the first one was Gitlow versus New York. It was a freedom of speech case in 1925. When the court came down with that decision, it applied freedom of speech, the First Amendment right, to all the states. Neer versus Minnesota in 1931, freedom of the press. Dijon versus Oregon, 1937, freedom of assembly. Cantwell versus Connecticut, freedom of religion, 1940. The right to bear arms, McDonald versus the city of Chicago and DC versus Heller. No quartering soldiers has not been incorporated yet because we not have any issue in which a state has used the National Guard and forced an individual to quarter soldiers or have them living in someone's private home. No unreasonable searches and seizures. Wolf versus Colorado, 1949. The exclusionary rule, Matt versus Ohio, 1961. The exclusionary rule came up that if you have not received a proper warrant to search someone, that evidence is excluded. Just compensation, 1897, Chicago being a railroad company versus Chicago. Just compensation has to do with eminent domain, that in order to take private property, it's a due process. You must provide just compensation as the Constitution says so. Malloy versus Hogan, 1964, self-incrimination. It applied the Fifth Amendment to all the states. Benton versus Maryland, double jeopardy, 1969. You cannot try the same person for the same crime unless there is a show of fraud. So, double jeopardy, the Fifth Amendment protection. Grand jury indictment. This has been followed. It has not been incorporated because most states follow this. In re of Oliver, a public trial. You cannot deny a person a public trial if they request it. 1963, Gideon versus Wainwright, a right to counsel. Gideon could not afford counsel for his case. In this case, the state of Florida only would allow people who are in charge of, or who were charged with, I forget the term, but it was a capital offense, were allowed a right to free counsel. Gideon was not allowed to free counsel, even though his case was a misdemeanor. And eventually this went to the Supreme Court, where Gideon was acquitted from this because he didn't have a right to count. He didn't receive his right to counsel. Porter versus Texas, another Sixth Amendment case, confrontation of witnesses. It applied to the states that if you are charged with a crime, you have every right to have witnesses be confronted in court. Impartial juries in Parker versus Gladden, 1966. You have a right to speedy trial, 1967. Colfer versus North Carolina. This right here is still being violated, where people are being held for over 2 years, and it's up to the defendant to request a speedy trial. Compulsory trial, 1967. This was applied in 1967 by Washington versus Texas. A criminal trial, Duncan versus Louisiana, 1968. The Seventh Amendment civil jury trial, not incorporated because most states abide by it. Robinson versus California, no cruel and unusual punishment. And Schliv versus Cuba, no excessive bail, 1971. These are all the different amendments that were applied through selective incorporation over the past 100 years. Now, we're going to go over the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, and it all has to do with freedom of religion. In the First Amendment, it clearly says that the federal government or any government cannot bar the freedom of religion or establish a religion thereof. Simply put, that there can be no law to pass to stop a religion, but there can be no law to say that America is a Christian country and the Christian religion is the state religion. We have none of that. That is the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, which is the First Amendment. The lemon test was created to determine, and I forget, it was Lemon versus, I forget the case off the top of my head, forgive me, but the Supreme Court created a test to determine if the federal or state government was violating the First Amendment of establishing a religion when it passes a law that has to do something with religion. In order for a law to be constitutional when it deals with religion, it must have a secular purpose. It must not advance or prohibit a religion, and it must not entangle government with religion. So when you look at the lemon test, if you have something that says religious schools may receive school vouchers, okay, must have a secular purpose. The secular purpose is school vouchers for schools because students are members of a state. They are entitled to receive the same compensation for schooling as anyone else for the secular purpose. Must not advance or prohibit a religion. Giving that school voucher, if it any way advances that specific religion or prohibits a religion from advancing itself on its own, will be improper and must not entangle government with religion. It must not entangle government with religion in any way. So when you look at the lemon test, when it comes to school vouchers, giving it to religious schools, this is where it violates. You must not entangle government with religion, because once you give government money to any religious group, all bets are off, because you must follow government rules when receiving that money. That's how the lemon test is applied when a state or the federal government passes a law that concerns religion. The Free Exercise Clause, basically that you cannot, the federal or state government cannot pass a law that would limit a religion. But remember, the Free Exercise Clause is not an absolute. You have to ask yourself, what is a religious faith? What is a religious faith? Does government interests outweigh free exercise right? Restriction on religious practice of Muslim inmates could be an idea, but think about it. Key question, what is a religious faith? Well, you may know it when you see it. When someone prays to a deity, to anything natural, what exactly is a religious faith? Government interests can outweigh free exercise rights. Does it really? So the protection of the citizenry will outweigh the rights of religion? How is that possible? You have to ask yourself. The example it gives is a restriction on religious practice of Muslim inmates. What restrictions can you put on practices of Muslim inmates for the free exercise thereof? This can be answered actually quickly, because in prison, you have a lot of rights taken away, but people are still granted their protections. What restrictions on religious practices of Christian inmates or Buddhist inmates? You have to ask yourself these questions when you're looking at cases. Does the federal government have the right to restrict or allow? The First Amendment guarantees freedoms of speech, press, assembly, and petition. The freedoms of speech and the press, protection of speech and press, unprotected speech and press, and freedom of assembly and petition. When we talk about freedoms of speech and the press, everyone thinks that you have the right to say anything. You don't. As a member of the press, you think you have the right to basically report anything. No, you don't. There is some protected speech and there is some protected press. There is some unprotected speech and unprotected press. Freedom of assembly and petition is guaranteed as well. So let's talk about those. Now, freedoms of speech and the press. During the early days of the Constitution, we had the Alien and Sedition Acts passed. During, I believe was around 1803, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, and it censored criticism of government. Well, any criticism of government was not allowed. This stayed in law for almost 100 years. Slavery, the Civil War, and rights curtailment speech was again censored. During the Civil War, President Lincoln, through executive order, suspended free speech, due process, basically all the protections, because we were in the middle of a civil war. And he felt that in order to progress the war and to protect the country, civil liberties had to be restricted. World War I and anti-government speech. Check out the case Shinnick versus the United States. Shinnick was an opponent of World War I and felt that it was not in the best interest of the United States to fight this war. Shinnick was jailed in 1918, and it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they created the clear and present danger test. They said if speech during a time of war caused a clear and present danger to the United States, speech can be curtailed and people can be jailed. Shinnick spent about 3 years in jail for his speech against the war. Protected speech and press. Limited prior restraints, which means censorship. Symbolic speech, which means anything that's considered symbolic, that is political, is speech, and hate speech. Unprotected speech. Now, understand what unprotected speech is. Unprotected speech is basically speech that is not political. If you write about someone and it's a lie, then it is considered liable. You are responsible for that speech, and it's not protected by the Constitution. So for those of you who love to put everything out on social media, there are a large number of liable cases now going through the court system, and the Supreme Court will be hearing several of them soon. And if the Supreme Court holds those liable cases as correct. That means the speech you write on social media, and especially if it's a lie, you will be responsible for it. And you may have to pay someone in a lawsuit. Slander is basically telling a lie about someone in public, in a speech. It's like saying person A is a terrorist. He knows it, you know it, you are a terrorist. And this guy says, you're a liar, and I can prove it, and you're hurting my reputation because of it. That is considered slander, and that person can sue you. Fighting words, essentially what it says. Fighting words, angry speech, words that are simply meant to fight, meant to confront. It's unprotected speech. It is liable speech. It is slanderous speech. And you can sue one person over that. Obscenity. This is weird. Obscenity is really based upon the norms of the area in which you live. So say in Oklahoma, it may be obscene to say out in public, goddamn. It may be very obscene to many people in the state of Oklahoma. But in the state of Georgia, you may say goddamn, and it means nothing. It's just a rant, an expression of anger, or just a curse. Well, in Oklahoma, that would be obscene, and you can be charged for obscenity for saying it. But in Georgia, you may not. It depends on the norms, the cultural norms and values of the specific area. And this is what the Supreme Court ruled. Freedoms of assembly and petition. Among the most controversial freedoms are the freedoms of assembly and petition. They hinge on peaceful conduct, and the Supreme Court has rarely addressed the right to petition. All right, let's go with the freedoms of assembly. The freedom of assembly, everyone has a right to assemble peacefully, as the Constitution says. So say like Black Lives Matter wants to protest. Well, they can. But you can't just start going out in the street and protesting. You want to go out in the street and peacefully protest. You must follow the law of your state and community. So if you're going to have a protest, petition your community to say, we're going to protest from point A to point B, allow them to set up the appropriate safety precautions for that area. And when you go and protest, protest. But you don't have a right to destroy property. You do not have a right to assault persons. You don't have a right to display hate speech. No fighting words. You must be peaceful. Freedom of assembly is one of our greatest protected rights that a lot of people don't talk about. Protesting or direct action is one of the most used forms of rights that we have, and it's one of the greatest protections, but people rarely talk about it. The right to petition or sue the government. The Supreme Court has rarely addressed the right to petition, but has upheld it. You may petition the government. You may sue the government. You may bring any civil wrongs to the government, and you have a right to be heard. The Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. This is one of the most controversial amendments of the Constitution because there are several ways in which the court has basically interpreted this. It was the Second Amendment was included so that basically the government, be it the US government and eventually through selective incorporation in the 14th Amendment, state government cannot disarm militias. And during the time when the Constitution was created, disarming militia meant disarming individuals. And individuals were called together with their armaments to form a militia to protect your local area, your state, or the federal government. But since then, we've had created our own militias through the National Guard. So there's an official militia. And of course, we have our own military. But this is where many people see that the Second Amendment is outdated because militia is not needed because we have the National Guard. We have protection from the state. But this is what a lot of people don't see. The Second Amendment is needed because it was put into place to prevent Congress from disarming militias, state militias. But if you look at this from this point of view, any state militia or National Guard can be instantly federalized. And it's a federal army. So when this happens, and if the federal government is turning against the sovereign states, how would a state protect itself from its citizens, with its citizenry? So the Second Amendment is not necessarily outdated. However, with the gun violence that we see, we know that we have so many actors in this country that are irresponsible and not abiding properly by the laws of the country when it comes to firearms or just being responsible for them. So DC versus Heller is a case in which basically Washington, D.C. had outlawed firearms, totally outlawed it. So Mr. Heller, who was a reserve officer, applied to get a firearm because he was a reserve officer, and he was denied. He brought the case forward through court, went through the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court held that the Second Amendment is an individual right, that no government, federal or state, has a right to limit it. Eventually, in McDonald versus the city of Chicago case, it upheld that, where DC versus Heller applied to the federal government because DC is not a state. It is a federal district, where McDonald versus the city of Chicago applied to a state, and the same right was upheld. So because of two subsequent court cases, DC versus Heller and McDonald versus the city of Chicago, it is an individual right to bear arms. And as of a couple of days ago, and we just had passed, let's see, California firearms. Yes. just 3 days ago, a case that went to the Supreme Court. And let's see. And I want to get the name of this. I'm not going to use it here, but this is just new law that just came into place. And I'll try to get the name of them here. All right, it was Miller versus California, in which the state of California outlawed semi-automatic weapons and assault weapons. And in this case, a citizen of California, Mr. Miller, disagreed with it because he wanted to keep his AR-15. Went to court, the California courts upheld it, eventually went to the US Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court 3 days ago came down to the decision that Mr. Miller is correct. The Second Amendment is an individual right, and he has every right to retain his AR-15. So even today, now with 3 court cases, it has been firmly established that an individual right to bear arms, and there will be no limitation on what weapon to purchase or that you can keep. Now, we have gone through our basic rights that everybody knows. The right to free speech, the right to press, the right to a religion, or you can't establish a religion, peacefully assemble and to petition, in the Second Amendment rights. Everybody knows those. But here's other rights that has to do with criminal defendants, or these are called equal protection and due process rights. The Fourth Amendment against searches and seizures, the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination and double jeopardy, the Fourth and Fifth Amendments and the exclusionary rule when it comes to illegal searches, the Sixth Amendment and the right to counsel, that everyone has a right to counsel, the Sixth Amendment in jury trials, that you have a right to stand trial in front of a jury, and the Eighth Amendment against cruel and unusual punishment. Now, the Fourth Amendment, let's go over that right quick. Police must obtain search warrants for searchers through your house, offices. You have an expectation of privacy. Warrantless searches, reasonable suspicion without consent, in situations no expectation of privacy. So let's explain all of this. So let's say you have been charged with selling drugs from your home. Okay, so if the police want to search your office, wants to search your house, wants to search your property, be it a car or what have you, they must get a warrant. Why? Because in your house, because on your property, your private papers, you have an expectation of privacy. You have a right to protect your privacy. However, police don't need a warrant when they have a reasonable suspicion, have your consent, or in situations with no expectation of privacy. So let's say you are dealing drugs and you have been observed handing drugs to someone and receiving cash. There's no expectation of privacy because you did that out in public. It's a reasonable suspicion because you have been seen to do it. So police can come up to you and search your vehicle. Now, if you are driving a car, and if you do have drugs in your car, and you happen to have a wonderful trap that was put in there by a friend, and the police ask you after they stopped you, You give us consent to search a car? Sure. Thinking that they'll never find your trap. And the cops will search your car all over, trying to find the drugs that they believe you have. And then they bring a dog and find your trap. Then they got you. So essentially, if you are ever pulled over, even with a suspicion, and they tell you things will go well for you if you simply give us consent to search your car, even though you may be innocent, don't give them consent. And you have to ask yourself and ask them, what was your reasonable suspicion of me having drugs? Because I drive through this neighborhood? Because I'm a marginalized person? Ask those questions. Because they can't profile you because you're Black, Hispanic, Asian, Native, or poor white. They can't profile you because you come from a neighborhood in which a lot of drug activity is happening. They can't profile you because your car looks like maybe a drug dealer's car. So ask them straight up, what is your reasonable suspicion of me for you to stop me and ask me that question? Get it out there. Make sure it's asked. And if they say, well, can we search your car? No. You may be innocent as hell, but no. Be resistant to the government. I understand law and order, but government has no right to invade your personal property and space. Okay, we'll bring the dog. Well, this is actually being challenged now because the dog can sniff out drugs. And if there is no reasonable suspicion and there is an expectation of privacy, if a dog goes around your car now, that has now been challenged and it's going through the court systems, a number of cases, to see if that's violation of privacy, if that's violation of the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, in which the exclusionary rule will be applied. So don't give any quarter in this. If you are stopped, do not allow anyone to search your car unless they have a warrant. Stand up for that. If you want to stand up for America, don't listen to all that crap you hear on TV, radio from certain groups. Stand up to America. Stand up for America by making sure that civil liberties are protected. The Fifth Amendment, the protection of self-incrimination and double jeopardy. The right to a grand jury. You have every right to a grand jury, especially in a capital case. You have a right for a jury out there to look over the materials of your case and to see if there's enough evidence to charge you for a crime. Protection against self-incrimination. You have every right to keep your damn mouth shut. Protect yourself from incrimination. If someone says, you know what, it will go better for you if you just tell us the truth, that is not always the case. Usually someone, a state actor, be it a police officer from a community or state police, is arresting you for something. And if they may make a deal to protect you from self-incrimination, if you give up some information about what you were doing and whatever, still does not protect you from the federal level. Remember, 2 sovereign jurisdictions. And if you're stopped on the street, that will be considered interstate commerce. If you're stopped with a certain amount of illegal material, it could violate federal law. So keep your mouth shut and ask for an attorney. Miranda versus Arizona. In Miranda versus Arizona, came the Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you may say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, the state can provide you an attorney. Do you understand these rights? Miranda versus Arizona. Miranda was arrested and did not know his rights under the Fifth Amendment. And they brought this case before the Supreme Court, and through selective incorporation through his case, Fifth and Sixth Amendment protections were applied. Double jeopardy. The government does not have a right to charge you twice for the same crime. So say if you are charged with hit and run of, who knows, Dave Chappelle. Say you're charged a hit run of Dave Chappelle and you have been acquitted and there was no intention, the state government has no right to charge you again. They cannot. However, this is the trick. The federal government can charge you in violation of civil rights against Dave Chappelle if you intentionally did try to hit that person. So yes, it depends. Double jeopardy is applied depending upon the level in which the charge is brought. So remember that. All right, the Fourth and Fifth Amendments and the exclusionary rule. Mapp versus Ohio. Let's see. Exceptions to the exclusionary rule. Good faith mistakes. So what this means is if the police search your vehicle, your home, your papers, your documents, and did not have a warrant, and if there was a good faith error made by the police, it is allowed. However, the exclusionary rule means that any materials, any incriminating evidence found in your office, your vehicle, your property, papers, anything, and there is no warrant, it excludes those incriminating evidence will be excluded. It cannot be used against you. It cannot be used against you. But good faith errors are allowed. But you have to prove that the police made a good faith error. And this is something that a lot of people do not attack because police seem to make a lot of good faith errors in a lot of cases. The Sixth Amendment and the right to counsel. Like Gideon versus Wainwright, 1963. Gideon was a Florida resident. He wanted the right to have counsel. But like I said earlier, that his right to have counsel was denied because his case was not considered a capital case. So he defended himself the best possible way he could and was convicted. He appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court and eventually with the Gideon versus Wainwright case that everyone has the right to counsel no matter what. And a lot of courts still don't abide by this. And you, as citizens, when this is not being abided by, must challenge it in court. Speedy and public trial by impartial jury, right to confront witnesses, and jury of your peers. Speedy trial. If you want a speedy and impartial trial, the Sixth Amendment protects you that. You have every right to do that. the right to confront witnesses. The state cannot hide witnesses from you. If they put you on trial, the witnesses must testify in open court that you or that they saw you do a criminal act. Jury your peers. Now, under the jury of your peers, you have every right to have a jury that looks like you, of your community. No one has a right to specifically take away members of the jury that look like you, or remove people of the jury that doesn't represent your gender. So these cases are also involved and protected under the Sixth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment and the cruel and unusual punishment. Usually cruel and unusual punishment focuses on death penalty, but it does apply to a lot to life cases. Like one of the biggest issues out there right now is solitary confinement. We know that if you put human beings in a solitary condition for a long period of time, it drives people insane. There's plenty of evidence that shows this. Also, the Furman versus Georgia case questioned the constitutionality of the death penalty, and it suspended the death penalty for a number of years. And we have seen more and more where not only the states have abolished the death penalty by causing cruel and unusual punishment when putting people to death, but the number of wrongfully convicted people by putting them on death row or even executing them has proven that states overall have violated the Eighth Amendment. Now, I'm a conservative, and I'm being honest about it. I'm not a death penalty advocate because I'm Catholic, but I feel that putting someone to death when it comes to depends on the reason. If you wind up, you've killed children, if you killed a large number of people, yes, I believe you are a danger to society and you should be put to death. But if you're going to charge someone with death, I believe you have to have ample, overwhelming evidence to be able to say that this person deserves death. You can't go on just a few witnesses that think they saw or think they heard something. You have to be sure, 100% sure, if you're going to put someone to death. Because we have seen now, especially in the last 15 years, the number of people who have come off death row who are innocent, clearly innocent. And if we have, and it has been documented, we have put many innocent people to death. And what makes me angry about it, many Black people to death for crimes they didn't commit. So when it comes to the Eighth Amendment, I'm an advocate of this, and that it should be applied. Sorry for my dogs here, guys. The right to privacy. When it comes to birth control, abortion, and LGBTQ issues. All right, let's get down to it. Right to obtain contraceptives. Griswold versus Connecticut. This is a case in which a husband and wife in their own bedroom use contraception to prevent from getting pregnant. But the state of Connecticut, which the vast majority of people who live in Connecticut were Catholic, and when the law was passed in the state of Connecticut, it was Catholic-inspired rule that that contraception should be made illegal. Well, in this case, One of the members of the Griswold family told someone else that they used contraception in order not to get pregnant. And eventually they were arrested and charged for this crime. This case eventually went to the Supreme Court. And when it went to the Supreme Court, a whole new way of interpreting the Bill of Rights came into play. The court under Griswold versus Connecticut states that the protections, the equal protections under the Bill of Rights, like the right that you must have, must protect against wrongful searches and seizures, the right to not self-incriminate, the exclusionary rule from Matt versus Ohio, the right to an attorney, all of these different civil liberties, basically 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendment was a form of inferred or numerous, how the Supreme Court explained it, a living document that clearly protects privacy, and especially privacy in one's own home. And therefore, if a married couple decides to do something in private in their own home, they should be protected. And in 1965, when Griswold versus Connecticut came through, it establishes in law the interpretation of the right to privacy that is inferred from the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments. This is huge because this, even though if you look at the 4th Amendment, you have a right against warrantless searches. That means government must have a warrant to search your person, your property, your papers. Privacy. You have a right to not self-incriminate yourself. So that means anything you do, you have the right to keep your mouth shut. And it's guaranteed. You have right of protection. You have a right to protection for due process and to keep your mouth shut until your attorney comes and to protect yourself while you're going through that process. And you have a right to no cruel and unusual punishment. It means your mind, body, and soul does not have to go through cruel and unusual punishment by the state. So the Supreme Court saw that these amendments as a whole is an inferred right of privacy. And this is where we get our rights to privacy. Understand this, everyone. There is nothing on the books that specifically gives you a right to privacy. There is no true constitutional amendment that specifically spells out a right to privacy. That means if the interpretation of the court changes in subsequent cases in the future, the right to privacy as we know it can go away. So in order to guarantee the right to privacy, there needs to be a constitutional amendment. But this is where things get different. This is a birth control case. But let's go to this case. Abortion. Roe v. Wade prohibits states' ban on abortion. Planned Parenthood versus Casey, restrictions cannot place undue burden on women. Whole Women's Health and Hellerstrand overturned Texas law restricting abortion. Now, you ask yourself, what does abortion has to do with privacy? It has everything to do with privacy. When Mrs. Rowe, which is a pseudonym, was pregnant and she needed to get an abortion in the state of Texas in 1973, the state of Texas simply, the only thing that could be made out in this law that you cannot get an abortion unless there is endangerment to the mother. That's it. Okay, what form of endangerment to the mother? What form of endangerment life to the mother? Now, off the top of your head, you're thinking, okay, if the mother's pregnant, if it's probably going to cause the mother to die to have this baby, then this is the only time an abortion is allowed. But it doesn't say that. It simply says endanger to the life of the mother. This, when Roe had her abortion, state of Texas charged her. She appealed through the state courts and eventually went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court came back that abortion was allowed based upon the rights of privacy. That a woman has the right to do what she wants to with her own body, and it's her right to privacy to do it, and no state has a right to restrict it. Subsequent cases came down the line to do the same thing. And eventually, a lot of laws from states have been challenged to overturn Roe v. Wade. But they all missed the point. Because most cases or most laws that applied to Roe v. Wade, that applied to restrict abortion, is under the idea of protecting the life of the child or the fetus. I understand this. Being a conservative, I personally would not want my children nor my wife to have an abortion. I believe that every life is special and sacred. But I do understand situations in which a mother may need an abortion. Being a Black person, knowing the level of poverty among Blacks, Hispanics, Natives, poor white people in this country, I understand the need of abortion in that way. But I also understand when a woman has been a victim of crime, why she may want an abortion. And I don't have to spell it out which crimes. And I could also understand why doctors may grant a late-term abortion because it may endanger the life of the mother if it's properly spelled out. So in order to bring up, in order to settle this issue, well, what politicians are going to have to do, what activist groups are going to have to do, is when they have laws to restrict or to expand abortion, they need to address one basic issue: the right of privacy. Once you address that issue, the right of personal privacy, everything else is elementary. You must protect the privacy of the woman, plain and simple. She has a right in her own mind to decide what she has to do with this body of hers. It is her private decision. It's her family's private decision. It is her and God. And that must be honored. And when that is honored, proper laws can be passed. But going on to continue on just simply just to say, well, on a moral reason, this is why this should happen, in which I clearly understand. In many ways, I agree. You have to think about the vessel in which that fetus is being carried. She has the ultimate, and you have to respect her decision on how she should proceed. Once that is respected, and once all the crap rhetoric on both sides of the issue go out of the way and find a way to protect the privacy of that woman, this right here will be settled. LGBTQ issues. Right to privacy extends to private sexual behavior, such as Lawrence v. Texas. It's a sodomy case. And basically, two people who love each other were having sexual relations, and in Texas, this was illegal. And really, this law was really put in place to stop or to prevent homosexual activity, even though this activity happens with homosexuals and heterosexuals. But it was mostly to stop homosexual activity. Because of Griswold versus Connecticut, because of Roe v. Wade, the rights of privacy was extended to LGBTQ. This right here and subsequent cases after says LGBTQ individuals have a right to privacy in their own home, in their own lives, to govern what they do. This also extended the right to marry. Now, the right to marry, which is a civil rights issue, came along because the state of Hawaii approved it for LGBTQ members to get married, upheld that, and this couple moved to Alabama, where Alabama forbade it. Case went to the Supreme Court, and under the full faith and credit clause of the U.S. Constitution, it was upheld that gay marriage is to be observed in any state in which the people have received a marriage license from another. So the right to privacy. So for all of you who have religious issues with Roe v. Wade and LGBT, it is not a religious decision why these cases were decided upon. It was on the rights of privacy. My privacy, your privacy, their privacy. Find a way to protect the privacy of yourself and these people. And you can resolve these issues. But until that is settled, these issues will be considered a religious issue or a progressive issue. And I don't think it's silly, the issues and things that they see. I understand the overall culture of our country, but the overall right of privacy among us, the right to say, it's none of your business what I do, is protected, and that must be sustained. All right, I double clicked here. Civil liberties in combating terrorism. Well, to be quite honest, the U.S. Patriot Act no longer exists, but it violated a lot of what the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendment protections. And this is the end of it all, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. To fight terrorism, we cannot allow the government to overstep their constitutional protections. It may sound liberal, but when the government is after you and violating these protections when they come after you, ask me at that time, are you conservative or liberal? It's not a conservative or liberal thing. It's an American thing. We must make sure these protections are in place, but we must also help law enforcement to protect us. But we cannot, unless we decide in a constitutional amendment as a society to give up our rights to privacy, to give up some of our protections for security. My question is to you, do you want to do that? Do you feel that we should do that? And if so, then step up and say that. Declare that. Be the first one who wants to give up your right to privacy. Be the first one who believes that cops should come to your place and search for anything under the just basic suspicion that you may be doing something wrong. And if you don't mind, that's the way it should be. All right, enough ranting on my part. All right, what I need you to do for chapter 4 is look under the chapter 4 and chapter 5 supporting documents. And in this chapter 4 and chapter 5 supporting documents, under chapter 4, you will see Engel versus Vattel, Wisconsin versus Yoder, New York Times versus the United States, Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District, Shinnick versus United States versus Lopez, McCullen versus Maryland, Miranda versus Arizona, Griswold versus Connecticut, and Roe versus Wade. Look over these cases and get to know them because you will be tested over them. I expect you to bring up questions in class when that occurs, when we come to class after you look at this video. But look over them, look over deeply. I will have parts of several of these cases in your exam. And you have to analyze these cases, and give me an essay answer that shows you do or you perform a good analysis of the case. All right, with all that being said, civil liberties are our protection against government intrusion. Civil liberties is the only thing that stands in the way of the federal and state governments violating our privacy, violating our home, our property, violating our pursuit of happiness, violating our lives. And you must decide as a citizen if you want that to happen. And this comes back around to my idea of voting, my passion of voting. If you want to defend these civil liberties, vote. Remember, if you feel that your civil liberties have been violated and you don't vote, how can you keep the representative of your government accountable to you if you don't say anything? It's on you. All right. Next up is Chapter 5, Civil Rights. and we're going to get into it more. I didn't expect this to go as long as it did, but it did. So until that time, remember to do your best. Always think critically. That means look at both sides of the issue, study it, and become an informed and make an informed decision. And remember, God bless you, and you have a good day. Thank you.